Good afternoon and a happy new year to you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Mills. I'm a senior associate at Zien Group, and I would like to welcome you all to today's FS Club webinar, where we're going to be discussing cracking down on greenwashing with satellite and ground sensor networks. Now, I'm joined by two very distinguished speakers. We've got Tac Leung, the CEO of the Secured Carbon, and Professor Paul Palmer, who is Professor of Quantitative Earth Observation at the University of Edinburgh. Now, as always, the agenda for this webinar is very simple. Following my introduction, our speakers are going to make their presentation, and then we're going to move on to the Q&A session. Now, I'm afraid that you're all muted, but you are able to submit your questions through the chat tool to the right of your screen. Please do chip in at any point of the proceedings. I'm going to be collating your questions and I'll put them to our speakers at the end. Now, as with all of our FS Club webinars, we're going to be recording this session and you're going to be able to access the slides and presentation at a later date. But before we move on, I really must thank FS Club members who've opened up our webinar series to the public. With their help, since March of 2020, we've held over 300 of these events on topics as diverse as money laundering, the metaverse, and high salinity agriculture. The FS Club is the premier global executive knowledge network for technology and finance, where members and their guests can meet over a glass of wine to debate key issues which impact on financial services, technology and society. It's very much like a 21st century version of the city's 17th century coffee houses. And so, without further ado, I would like to introduce the first of today's speakers, Tac Leung. Tac, tell us about cracking down on greenwashing.
Thank you, Simon. Can you, oops, this is the old technical. So I have here in the background just a sample of one of the diagrams we'll be showing today, just to drill into some visuals of the data sets that we're looking at. This is an Earth observation system that we're building, and I'm partnered with Professor Paul Palmer here to share with you the state of the art where we're at in applying these technologies to the financial markets. A little footnote here, the diagram is showing nitrogen dioxide, which is not CO2, and we'll go into that a little bit deeper. These are the gases that are available in the satellites today. So we're making do with what we have, and there's a roadmap to better satellites and technology, which we'll discuss in this presentation. So the problem that we're facing today, greenwashing, as defined by the UN Secretary General late last year, COP27, is around, it's a multi-point problem, right? It's what is net zero? How are committed parties mapping that? How are they self-reporting? So there's a set of wicked problems around this. And what we find with many organizations is that they set net zero targets and they publish them as per the guidelines. Curious in this call, on this webinar, if there are individuals either personally or for their organization that have set a net zero target, and if so, please use this poll to share your target.
Perfect, Tac. I've opened that poll now. We've got about half the audience voted, and I'll just leave it open for a couple more seconds. And I'll share the results with you now.
Got it. Okay, 2030 is the lead here, and no targets, no data, no target set. So this is quite a committed group. Obviously, 2030 is a common target, which, for example, London has set. So just putting that aside, I'll come back to that in a moment. Part of the logic of setting these targets, right, is that, as you might have seen, for quite a few decades now, that we have a CO2 concentration in the atmosphere that's heading up towards what maps to 1.5 degrees centigrade. At the same time, there has been a push, particularly the green bond market has been growing really quite healthily up until last year. This year, there's a bit of a depression in that. You write off a number of factors, war and other energy or general economy. But what we do know from the most recent study by Swiss Re is that the target which the UN and World Bank had set of about 90 trillion was their estimate needed to meet the Paris Agreement goals. Swiss Re has come in and said, actually, it's quite a few factors higher than that. So trillions of investment predicted needed to bend this curve. The subdivisions here you might be familiar with in terms of carbon accounting. There are certain categories, line items that are common across reporting. And we'll go a little deeper further in this presentation about how we can see particular line items given their signatures in the atmosphere. So next poll here, confidence in the green markets. Who of you have invested towards net zero?
Just leaving that poll open a little bit longer now so everyone can send in their answers. Up to about 50% there. And I will share the results with you now.
Green energy is in the lead, and electric car. We've got interesting equal 8% green bond buyers and carbon offset buyers. As you can see from this poll, the maturity of the trading markets is fairly low, right? I think that and this is when we start to talk about the mechanics of greenwashing and the effects of it, right? So greenwashing as kind of the articulation of a fairly complex set of uncertainties around how finance and climate are intertwined and how we can affect it. There's a lot more to think through here or speak through here, but moving towards how we characterize these uncertainties, secured carbon has developed. This is over quite a lot of time. I've been working in the carbon markets. 2015 was when I started trading. 4 AI modules or layers, because there is quite a lot of data that is being collated here. And there are 2 reporting modules, which we call books. And today we'll be focusing on the AirMiner AI module specifically. And we'll map some use cases of how we can bring together some of the self-reported targets of organizations or cities. In this case, I'll be showcasing London, and how we then use the network of available data and observation systems to come together, process the big data that comes through this, and articulate it in a way that the markets can understand. So, as I mentioned earlier, London is a 2030 target city. The breakdown here in London is quite interesting. You can see that around the fringes, Kingston and Bromley, for example, have kind of chosen different sides of 2030. Tower Hamlets, very surprisingly, right in the center there, is ambitiously going for 2025. So with this information and this map, what AirMiner does is we identify the boundaries of the fiduciary and then take the data from the observation systems, and first pass is we harmonize that data and overlay it onto the fiduciary zone. The second articulation we have to do here, calculation we have to do here, is that there are a portfolio of gases that are emitted by different economic activities. So also mapping these through is a second activity. And this is where you can start to see the complexity of the data and why we need some very heavy machine learning processing behind it. We will be drilling today mostly into methane, into CH4 down here. And that's because the state of the art currently CO2 is nascent, the measurement of CO2, even though it's the poster child gas, it's our ability to assign fiduciary accountability for the emitter is still quite underdeveloped. So coming back to the slide that I showed at the beginning, this is the same data set that Professor Paul Palmer had processed using quite a advanced machine learning system to map. This is NO2. So NO2 is not one of the target greenhouse gases, but it is a side product of combustion. And as you can see here, between 2018 and 2020, think of this as a baseline. This is the areas where there are, where there were detected significant NO2 plumes. When we then come back to the target map for net zero, you can see, the boundaries towards the bottom here, the green zone. The satellites are telling us, well, between 2018 and 2020, not so much combustion happening there. Obviously, strong concentration in the center. Tower Hamlets being in the middle there, you look at that and you think, okay, well, this is going to be, harder for them than, for example, Sutton, right, or Kingston, in terms of bending the curve. And so what this allows us to do, what we've done here is we've taken the available data sets, which are not perfect. We don't know exactly what's going on, but we're working through the process of compressing them enough that we can set a baseline and set a delta. And so we have at least an indicator, right? It's not the actual measurement of CO2 that we can accomplish today, but we can see, in the next 2-year cycle, what the delta is between this year and that year and what the directions are, right? So we at least can get directional indicators. And then when we can, for example, in this case, show borough to borough, start to create some leaderboards about directionality. And that's, that's as far as we think we can push this today before we open up to, the next generation of sensors. Of which I'll give us a quick presentation on Beacon. This is one of our partners out of UC Berkeley in California. Professor Ron Cohen has deployed 5 of these test networks. They're about 1 kilometer spread. They sit on top of school buildings. And you can see down here at the bottom, the reading of CO2. So this is the key gas, right? And you can see that it's the top of this Thomas Aquinas is hitting 700 here. So this is the very same metric that we should not be going beyond 420 if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees. So you can see on the ground CO2 behaves like it does here. A lot of vehicular traffic. There's a lot of seasonality. It's a fairly complex gas to model. It carries on the wind, so it's a non-trivial calculation to find attribution, even when you have a kilometer grid of towers on the ground. And again, this is why the need for some machine learning power behind it. So I'm going to now hand over to Professor Paul, who is building, in charge of, a city dome network in Edinburgh. And I'm just going to hand that over to you now, Paul.
Okay, so I'm going to just talk for the next few slides, and I'll talk to forward the slides as I finish them. So this is an example of a concept that we're building right now. This is a concept focused on the city of Edinburgh. Much like the Beacon network, we will be using sensors around an area. And so the concept's quite simple. So air comes in, air comes out of this dome, and the difference between what goes out and what comes in is the net city emissions. Okay, so there we have real data to determine the trajectory of CO2 and methane emissions coming from the city of Edinburgh. So that's real life data rather than that will be reported. Now this will be augmented by street level mapping of greenhouse gases and air pollutants. And I'll go back to that point about air pollutants in a minute. But that will give you, there's different kinds of sensors. We'll try to get right into the city for a variety of reasons. One is to sort of build up a higher resolution map of those of greenhouse gases within a city. The air pollutants can help us to determine the attribution of CO2 and methane. So there are some clues. So NO2, for instance, or PM2.5, they give us some clue about the source of the CO2 and methane. So that's really important. The other reasons why we're picking on air pollutants is because of human health. So elevated air pollutants will be linked with human health issues, and also to try to inform policy implementation, things like the low emission zone. So this will be one of the cities where we're determining a baseline of some of the key pollutants before the low emission zone gets implemented. And both of these will be rolled out in sometime later this year. And the cool thing about the street level mapping is that we'll be using Internet of Things sensors linked with LoRaWAN, which is a low power Wi-Fi network, network that stretches across the city of Edinburgh. So it's kind of a cool technology proof of concept. If we go to the next slide, what we really want to do is to harness information from am I forwarding it? Oh yeah, okay. Information from some satellites, and as Talks said, the lowest hanging fruit here right now, given the current technology, is methane. And we now have the ability to look at asset scale methane emissions and with traceable uncertainties. And I have that in the slide really just to emphasize the fact that it's really important. Our focus is to focus on the estimates and the uncertainties and be able to trace back those uncertainties to the instrument methodology, because we're coming from a scientific background. Data without uncertainties has a limited worth. So if we go to the next slide, these will give you some examples of the data, the capabilities that we have right now. So this is an example, 3 examples of what we can get from Sentinel-2 data. This is an example of a satellite that wasn't intended to measure methane, but it does have sensitivity to methane. And these data are on the order of 20 meters. So it's incredibly detailed. And that's opened up a cottage industry of case studies in the peer review literature. So these are 3 examples across diverse scenes. Not all groups can do this level of diversity. So most of the activity is focused on the desert. Okay, it's fairly flat and bland. And this is an oil and gas extraction place over Algeria. And you can see we pinpointed this the 28th of February 2020, and there's an uncertain value and uncertainty. Large values, kilograms of methane per hour. We move to Kansas as an example of a compressor station. In this case, and you can see it's quite a very complicated background features of agriculture. And you've got this methane plume sitting above that. So it's quite a challenge for us to determine those plumes. And we're using all the machine learning techniques to hand to be able to distinguish that plume above the background. And the third one is an industrial complex over China. Okay, and again, it's another example where you've got quite a complex scene, and nevertheless, you can see this methane plume sitting above that. Now, if we go to the next slide, we need to put all that information into context of the complementary sources of information we have from GIS. We know where the pipelines are, we know where the extraction wells are. So some of that is already in the literature. So we pull that together to get to better understand the contribution from this particularly the oil and gas sector, to what we're seeing is a rapid growth in atmospheric methane over the last few years. Back to you.
So yeah, this is sort of a quick shortcut. We're at the end of our 20 minutes, and wanted to just really emphasize that while CO2 is the poster child, CH4 has exponentially more greenhouse effect than CO2. So when you're seeing plumes of 6,000 kilograms per hour, The equivalent here is in the sort of gigaton, it starts moving towards equivalence here. And Paul, I know as you're saying, there's a whole cottage industry of alarming reports that a rogue methane plume has been found. Just wanting to, while this doesn't get a lot of attention or hasn't traditionally, methane is spottable from the air, and it's associated with oil and gas, and there's quite a lot of rogue activity happening around here. And the current structure of cap and trade is assumes that people are reporting, self-reporting, honestly, and doesn't really account for a cap and trade system where you've got dishonest actors. So this is the beginning of just a thought experiment of what should we do when we find someone accountable for releasing multiple thousands of kilograms of methane per hour. Right, so we're pretty split here on fines and fiat, negative carbon credits, low-income decarbonization product. Now, these are some ideas, and this is the beginning of a conversation about what we think should be happening of a next level of cap and trade, which is more punitive, which is more regulatory. We know banks get subjected to large fines and fiat regularly, and this has some effect on the behavior. So thank you for your feedback here. That's the end of my bit.
Fantastic. Well, gentlemen, that was an absolutely fascinating talk. And I can see we have got a lot of questions from the audience. But as the chairman, the privilege of asking the first one falls to me. Now, this is a little bit of a technical one. As I understand it, one of the biggest issues facing satellite monitoring is the trade-off you've got between spatial coverage and the resolution of satellite images. How do you think this could be addressed?
That's a great question. There's a number of opportunities you can explore to improve that trade-off. So normally, a satellite will pass over in a particular orbit. It's called a polar orbit, and it's just passing over the same time of day all over the world. So for the CO2 and methane and air pollutants, that's typically early in the morning or mid-afternoon, where you've got a build-up of, you can see it. And so that presents problems, of course. So you've got the spatial resolution. Sometimes, certainly particularly these very high resolution satellites, you're seeing this like line across the surface of the Earth at a particular time. Now, there's a couple of things we can do. First of all, we can map the horizontal. We have instruments that sort of not just look straight down, but also look side to side. So you can map out a bit more of a thick, still retain the fine horizontal resolution, but may have those individual measurements across. And so you're starting to paint the Earth in a much quicker time scale. So the repeat time of those satellites would be a few days. So you'll get global coverage within a few days. The other another thing we could do is to have constellations. There's a number of satellites that are coming up. We're starting to see the private industry launch their own instruments, and so we can build up virtual constellations from the individual companies and the space agencies. But of course, that presents challenges in itself. So we need to make sure that they're calibrated. And again, that emphasis on uncertainty is really important. Calibration, uncertainty. And so having all those instruments together is a great opportunity only if we understand how they all fall together. And of course, the satellites are not the only thing that we have, right? In our armory, we have high altitude platforms, which we could have an instrument sitting on. We could have aircraft, we have ground-based networks. And the next challenge for us is to tie all that together. And again, calibration, having a standard in which all these different kinds of instruments fall together is really important. And that's really what we're going to be trying to aim for over the next few years.
Tac, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, Simon, and just to give a comparison to financial information, right? I mean, the standards we hold for science are perfection. right? If we don't have, margin of error confidence with, like 80% confidence is, not so good. Financial data, we're actually quite used to processing, very sparse data. And the way we handle this is we compress them into indicators, and then we baseline them. So we'll do a year over year, right? We'll do an annual comparison, rolling average. So the tools that financial quants have developed for processing financial data actually work quite well with this sort of high frequency granular environmental data. And that's what we're also developing in parallel, right? To being able to have redundant observations of a location. And this is very location driven. As you can see, geo resolution is very important. The other resolution is time. This is a time and space kind of equation. And so reason why I was showing a city target is that cities have very fixed geographic boundaries. Corporates, not so much, right? Definitely when you start dealing with transport systems, very wicked. So when we look at the carbon accounting book and the different line items of stationary, transport, and waste, and then we look at scope 1, 2, and 3, each one of these have their own kind of idiosyncrasies, and using the right tools for the right measurement, getting those to be standardized. We've been working with NIST in the United States, and Professor Palmer has been helping us connect also with NPL, getting to some standards of reporting for the science community that actually is good enough for financial community. We're there now, like we can do that now. We haven't actually run all the calculations, but when we look through what kind of indicators we can put and have a leaderboard for the boroughs of London, those kinds of things are within grasp today. Not with CO2, but with indicators, right? So again, this sort of, it's not GDP, but it's, a leading indicator of, and we can, and that's, that's the book project, is to how to articulate this in a investor-ready context.
Well, I think this is an incredibly exciting project you're working on, because what's fundamentally needed for accurate carbon accounting is this type of tool, which brings me on to a question which has been raised by several of our audience, which is around net zero itself. Net zero is a very woolly term, so how do you think organizations can use these tools to actually move towards net zero? What's meant by net zero, and how can your tool actually assist people with achieving this?
Yeah, Simon, I think the baselining, zero is it's a great term. I love net zero, definitely more than carbon neutral as a term, because it has a number in it. I know it's a hidden number, and it's not ordinal. But the benefit here is that the understanding that there's a balance in your carbon budget, right? And that is just stating what we know in financial terms is good accounting, which is you should zero your budget. So just that as a concept to put that out there. Now, when we actually look at all the line items, I think the wickedness here is in the line items. It's like, well, if I'm breathing, I'm reducing, I'm releasing carbon dioxide. Does that count? The cows, flatulence that I ate, does that count, right? There's this kind of woolliness around what the scope problem is. One thing that in exploring supply chain, I've worked in a few supply chain projects. When we think of scope 1, 2, and 3, which is where I think that one of the fuzziness around the edges is, well, I'm net zero with scope 1, and then Greta Thunberg gets up and says, well, you're not on scope 3. And you think, well, yeah, that's true. And then we're kind of rolling around. So scope 1 is you. Scope 2 is obviously your energy provider. And then scope 3 is supply chain, right? This is not a new concept. Supply chain tracking, supply chain transparency has been a wicked problem for a long time. So when we start here, when we talk about net zero, what you can control is scope 1. When you press the pedal on your combustion vehicle, when you turn on your gas, that's scope 1. You burned it. And there are only actually a few combustion chambers in our lives. The kind of archetypes are you've got one in a vehicle and you've got one in your home to heat the space, and you might have maybe one more or two for cooking. right? So there's maybe 3 furnaces here. So scope 1 is, okay, did you turn that? Every time you turn that, that's you. If everyone accounted for their scope 1, scope 3 would be solved. So let's do scope 1. Let's not confuse, the supply chain problem with, accountability for self. This whole, well, they're not doing something, so why should I do something? That's a Mexican standoff, right? Just we don't move.
Absolutely, it's all about the art of the possible. Now, Paul, I've got a particular question about Edinburgh here. In the slide introducing Gemini, you've got a picture of where the network's going to be. Our questioner is intrigued to know if those are decided placements, and if so, why you don't have a sense at the bottom of Leith Street when that's the windiest area and assumably will pick up the most change.
No, we haven't decided. Okay, so for the dome, we want to capture the whole cities, but the exact location of the sites have not been decided yet. We still need to do some calculations. So the questioner is absolutely correct. That's something that we'll need to look into. I would say that individuals, there's, for those that know about Edinburgh, there's Old Town and New Town. New Town is, I don't know, Edwardian. It's like straight lines, and there's very clear ventilation from one area to the next. And there's Old Town, which is very, 3D city and sort of all nooks and crannies, which is going to be very difficult to instrument. There, for both of those situations, we'll be using the in situ instrument. So we'll be hopefully lining the streets with sensors, so we can pick up some of what your question had suggested. But the greenhouse gas dome concept is very different to what I'm really interested in, sort of the integrated city emission rather than individual street canyons.
Excellent. Right. With respect to the picture you're building up at a global level, is the intention to make this data open source, or are you going to be monetizing these data streams for the financial services sector?
I can take that to start with, Paul. So, for transparency, this sort of data really it's beneficial to all of us for it to be accessible. There is a mechanic that we found to be useful of monetizing recency, right? So if you are controlling a sensor, you might be able to use the alpha off of that sensor, and then, as it kind of decays, you can share it, right? For example. So the systems that we manage, and we ingest a lot of open source data. So, I think this conversation about data and data sharing is very, very important. The economics of the data is very important, and to set some good standard practices around monetization and privacy and ownership. We're not actually, well, secured carbon today is not in the business of hardware, right? So the networks that we're involved with that we pull data from, are partner networks. So really, we're a processing. This is where the AI part, right? Data quality is very important for us because garbage in, garbage out. So we're very involved in the sensor, at the reader level to really understand, the spectrum of the spectrograph and how all of this, so that we have confidence. We're verifying all of this data, but our model is in the processing, right? And the problem to be solved here is that we are facing an information overload situation already, and we don't even have the right technology in place, right? So what we, as a business model, are committed to is refining the data, getting it harmonized, and this is challenging. This is where a lot of the cost of AI is actually in the training and the cleaning up of that data. And that's certainly, for example, Al Gore's company, Climate Trace.
Climate Trace.
Yes, they're an org, right? And we've been working with them and looking at pulling some of their data. There are some groups that are more proprietary about their data, and this is more of a transactional, particularly in building sensors. There's a whole arc that we're working through here to standardize, at the meter level, because really when you look at the whole supply chain, there are the emissions that you can measure, but they're also the energy meters are, in our basements. These are very standardized systems. They're very mature. They're not sexy. Kind of overlook them, but they're crucial, right? They actually regulate, and the confidence in these are very high, right? Because the commercial checks and balances around energy meters are very well established. So whether it's pulling data from smart meters or from home meters, all of these kind of data streams, I think the world does need to develop kind of an awareness of how we can selectively be sure of the data while not requiring anyone to really have to go all the way through the data, to the endpoint and maybe expose privacy concerns or so forth. And that's where technologies like blockchain have some very interesting capabilities there. But it's a bit of a Rubik's cube.
Paul, have you got anything to add to that?
Well, no, only to emphasize the fact that the data that we collect will be freely available. It's freely available I mean, it's important that the raw data is transparent. It's got to be open to the public. There's a whole range of reasons why you might want to do that, including education, for instance.
Yeah, incredibly important.
Yeah.
Tac, I'm interested in your background in carbon trading, and I can see very strong links between the work that you're doing and verifying emissions for carbon trading purposes. Do you think that there will be a time when we're in a position to actually use your technology to check national inventories of carbon emissions? I mean, scaling it up, you were talking about privacy issues, but could you scale it up to a national issue, to the national level, and actually check carbon inventories at a national level for carbon trading purposes?
Simon, that's such a leading question. That's exactly what we're working on today. I'm actually about 6 hours away from submitting into a challenge for net zero home energy efficiency and net zero upgrades for the UK. So the goal there is to take the 29 million homes in the UK, oldest stock in Europe, made of brick, right? And just the envelope of the building just not ready for heat pumps. So those who have sort of started toying with evolving their energy systems have come across it's not a simple problem. When I talk about energy meters, that is the set that we're starting with there, because they're deployed. We have baseline. We have a lot of baseline on energy meters, and this is very well audited by UK Gov, energy BEIS, and that set. So if we look at the line items, we look through UK, and I have some appendix slides here, but I'll try to describe this. UK, well, London in particular reports within a group called C40, and there's a standard book for reporting this, right? There's the three verticals. Sorry, they tend to put the scopes as verticals, and then the horizontals are stationary, transport, and waste. Within stationary, there's residential, commercial, and there are a few other line items. London's top line item is stationary residential. The last time they reported was 2018. They haven't reported lately. This is part of the issue with low standards. And at the time, I tend to describe these inventories in carbon, tons of carbon per GDP or per capita, because that baselines, right? That means that I can look at Barcelona, which is the leader in Europe, and look at London, which is below average in terms of below being leading, but twice what Barcelona is doing. So how do we know, right? Like, how does it actually come together? There are big spreadsheet sets that are handed out by a group called GHG Protocol. These kind of filter through. It's a very Excel-driven workflow today, very error-prone if you have worked with Excel macros. And so, you know, this is part of the when you talk about actually distilling. So focusing on residential in the UK as part of an energy upgrade, you know, it's addressing a little bit of a sideline here, but you know, energy, inflation, security, right? There are many overlapping reasons why we should find the investment to upgrade the housing stock. So that project is a strong commitment by many parts of the government. Definitely London has been pushing on this as well. So that's the first line item that we're focusing on. That's the one that I think we can cross the threshold on because we have the meters, they're already here. Starting with residential and then getting into commercial buildings. So the stationary stock is known.
Absolutely. Now, there is a fabulous opportunity. There are 2 countries in the world now that have issued sustainability-linked bonds, which are linked to national targets. There's Chile, and I believe the other one is Ecuador. Both of which are going to require accurate measurements of carbon dioxide emissions. And I think there is a fantastic opportunity for you to link your monitoring systems to the yields on these bonds. You know, I really think there is a fabulous opportunity for you to get involved here.
Simon, we should have another webinar on that. We've actually developed some covenants, and we actually see the potential for what we call a dual return bond, because these investments are actually going towards avoidance. And there's some you know, concerns in the carbon offset business around accounting there. So both in terms of the bond side, the green bond side, and the carbon offset side, the greenwashing smear, I think, has really withheld a lot of early attempts. Myself, I don't trade carbon today. I don't know what it, you know, I don't have confidence in it. So I'm trying to build this, the kind of offset that I would, you know, that I would really trust. And what we found is that you have to go all the way down to the project, and that project has to be really well structured and standardized. And those projects are ripe for green bond investment. And this is where the UK housing stock transformation.
Absolutely, and with sustainability,
very much,
it's high stakes. They need the accurate data. Now, I could talk all afternoon, but I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, that time has caught up with us. I know that some of you still have questions to ask. Please do contact our speakers to continue this discussion. You can email us and we will pass your questions on. We're also going to be posting the recording of this presentation online in the next couple of days, so you can revisit what our speakers have said and their fantastic slides. It just remains for me to thank the members of the FS Club for making today possible. I'd also urge you to keep an eye on our forthcoming events page for more webinars. And coming up, we have got China's World, what does Xi Jinping want for his country, the curious economics of authenticity, and workers' voices fulfilling the S ambition in ESG. Now you can catch up with all our previous webinars on YouTube or our new Pizzazz TV channel, and we do hope that we're going to see you again soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.